My aunt reported me to CPS when I was 19 and struggling, and told the caseworker I was unfit. Now she wants to babysit after seeing where we live. When my aunt Celestine rang the doorbell of our house on a Saturday morning with a casserole dish and a smile I hadn't seen directed at me since I was 14, I stood in the doorway and felt my body do something that took me a moment to identify. Not anger, not surprise. Something older and more physical than either of those. The specific muscle memory of bracing for impact that I had developed over years of dealing with her and had apparently never fully unlearned. She was wearing a cream-colored blouse and had her hair done in the way she did for occasions she considered significant. And she was looking past me into the hallway with an expression I knew exactly. The expression of a person conducting an assessment they didn't want you to notice. Behind me was the house my husband Desmond and I had bought 8 months earlier. 3 bedrooms, renovated kitchen, good light, the kind of house that looks in photographs exactly like what it feels like to be inside it. Behind her, on the front step, was a casserole dish that smelled like the jollof rice she made at every family gathering and that I had loved as a child before I understood what it cost. She said, "I thought I'd come by and see the place. Bring something." I looked at her for a long moment and said, "Come in." Because I was 31 years old now and had learned things I couldn't have known at 19, and one of them was that some confrontations required you to let the other person enter the room first. I had been 19 years old and alone in a way that the word alone doesn't fully contain when Celestine made the call. My mother, her younger sister, had died when I was 17 of a cardiac event that was sudden enough to leave no time for preparation and thorough enough to leave me without the person who had been the structural center of my life. My father had not been in the picture since I was 11. There was an aunt, Celestine, who was 8 years older than my mother, and who had, at the funeral, told everyone present that she would look after me, which was the kind of sentence that means different things to different people. What it meant to Celestine, I came to understand, was something closer to, "I will maintain oversight of your situation and make assessments about your adequacy." I was 17 when she said it, and I was still in the mode of receiving everything an adult offered as genuine, which is a mode that specific experiences teach you to exit. I exited it at 19, in the worst possible way. My son Tobias was born 3 weeks before my 20th birthday, the result of a relationship that had ended badly 6 months before his birth in an apartment that was mine because I had been working 2 jobs to keep it mine, and which had, in the 2 weeks following Tobias's arrival, developed a heat problem severe enough that I had called the landlord 4 times without resolution. The apartment was cold. I was exhausted in the way that new mothers without support systems are exhausted. Completely. Neat through every layer of function, and Celestine had visited once, on the 5th day after I brought Tobias home, and had stood in the apartment with the same assessing expression she'd had at the door this morning, and had said things about the temperature and the state of the kitchen counter and the bags under my eyes that I had processed, through the fog of new motherhood and grief and isolation, as concern. They were not concern, they were evidence collection. The CPS caseworker came on a Wednesday morning 11 days after Tobias was born. Her name was on a card she handed me at the door. Ms. Yiwande Okafor, Child Protective Services, District 4. She was professional and not unkind, but she had a clipboard and a set of questions that she asked in the tone of someone executing a procedure, and the procedure had been initiated by a reported concern about a newborn's welfare in a cold apartment with an inadequately prepared young mother. I stood in my doorway holding my son and felt the specific terror of institutions arriving at your door when you have not done anything wrong but cannot immediately prove it. Ms. Okafor came inside. She looked at the apartment. She asked about heating. I showed her the text to the landlord, 4 of them, time-stamped. She asked about food. I opened the refrigerator and the pantry. She asked about support. I told her I had my neighbor, Mrs. Figueiredo, who was 68 and had been bringing me food since Tobias arrived, and who I could call right now if she wanted. She asked if there was family. I said, "My aunt called you." She did not confirm this. She didn't have to. After 90 minutes, she told me the apartment's heating issue was a landlord violation that she would be reporting separately, that my living situation, while tight, was functional, and that she was classifying the report as unsubstantiated but would schedule a follow-up visit in 30 days. She left a resource packet on my counter. I closed the door and stood in my living room holding Tobias against my chest and felt the specific cold of a thing that had been done to me settling into something I would carry for a long time. I confronted Celestine 3 days after Ms. Okafor's visit by phone because I did not have the transportation or the energy to do it in person, and because I needed to say what I had to say before the window of my nerve closed. I told her I knew she had made the call. She did not deny it. She said she had been worried. She said the apartment was cold, and I looked like I hadn't slept. She said she had done it because she cared, and because my mother would have wanted someone to make sure things were handled properly, which was the most audacious thing she could have said, and I told her so. She said, I was trying to help. I said, you called the government on me 11 days after I had a baby, with no heat because my landlord violated the lease, not because of anything I did. She said, you were 19 and alone. I said, I was alone because you didn't offer to help me. You offered to report me. She was quiet for a long moment, and then she said that I was too emotional to have this conversation right now, and that we could talk when I had settled down. I told her not to call me again and hung up. My hands were shaking so hard, the phone rattled against the counter when I put it down. Tobias was asleep in the bouncer seat Mrs. Figueiredo had lent me, his small face entirely relaxed, entirely trusting, entirely unaware that someone had just tried to take him. The follow-up visit came 30 days later as scheduled. Ms. Okafor was the same caseworker. In the month between visits, I had moved, with the help of Mrs. Figueiredo's son and a moving company I could barely afford, to a different apartment in the same building where the heating worked and the landlord had been formally cited. I had also, through a social worker referral Ms. Okafor had left in the resource packet, connected with a family support organization called New Roots that matched young parents with volunteer mentors. My mentor was a woman named Gloria Obeng, a retired social worker with 32 years of experience and the particular quality of someone who had seen every version of a difficult situation and had decided that most of them were survivable if you had the right information and someone to help you navigate it. Gloria met with me every week for the first 3 months. She helped me understand the CPS process, helped me create a documentation folder with all my receipts and records, helped me apply for childcare assistance that cut my expenses by $680 a month, and she sat with me twice when I cried in ways that had nothing to do with any specific problem and everything to do with doing something enormous without anyone who was supposed to help you. She was not family. She was better in several specific ways than family had been. Ms. Okafor closed the case at the second visit. She said the apartment was warm and clean, Tobias was healthy and clearly being cared for, and I had connected with appropriate support services. She said, "You've handled a hard situation very well." She said it with the neutrality of someone filing an accurate report, not offering praise, and I received it the same way. After she left, I called Gloria and told her the case was closed, and she said, "Good. Now we keep building." We kept building. I went back to work when Tobias was 4 months old, part-time at first and then full-time, with Tobias in subsidized childcare. I started taking online courses toward a nursing degree when he was 6 months old, one class at a time, in the hours after he went to sleep. I did not contact Celestine. She sent a text on Tobias's first birthday that said happy birthday to the little man, which I read and did not respond to. She sent a Christmas card that year and the year after. I kept them in a drawer not because I was uncertain about my feelings, but because I believed in maintaining records of things people did, which was a lesson Ms. Okafor's clipboard had taught me without intending to. Desmond came into my life when Tobias was 3. He was a civil engineer, 5 years older than me, with the steady, practical quality of someone who measured things for a living and applied the same approach to relationships. He had grown up in a household with a father who left when he was young, which gave him a specific appreciation for the presence he wanted to have rather than the absence he'd experienced. He and Tobias developed a relationship over 18 months of careful, unhurried time that I watched closely. Because Tobias was the thing I had built in the hardest years, and I was not going to hand proximity to him carelessly. By the time Desmond asked me to marry him, Tobias was 4 years old and had started calling him Deezy of his own initiative, one afternoon without preamble, as if the decision had been made internally and then announced when it was final. Desmond and I were married in a small ceremony when Tobias was 5. We bought the house when Tobias was 8 and I was 31, 2 months after I passed my nursing board exams, using a combination of my salary, Desmond's, and the savings I had been building since Tobias was 6 months old in the small, deliberate way of someone who understood that security was not given, it was accumulated. The house had 3 bedrooms and a yard and a kitchen with an island that I had wanted since I was 19 and had imagined as a specific marker of having arrived somewhere, and when we moved in I stood in that kitchen alone for a few minutes before the movers brought the boxes and just looked at it. It was into this house that Celestine walked with her casserole dish. She came inside, and I showed her around because I had decided to do this fully, to not cut the visit short, to see the whole thing through to its natural conclusion. She moved through the rooms with the same assessing expression she'd had at my old apartment, except the assessment was going differently now, and I could see it registering in the small adjustments of her face. The slight widening at the kitchen island, the pause at Tobias's room where his bookshelf took up an entire wall, and his soccer trophies were lined up on the windowsill. She said, "This is lovely." I said, "Thank you. We love it." She asked about the neighborhood, about the schools, about whether the commute to the hospital where I worked was manageable. I answered everything. She sat at the kitchen island while I made tea and talked about family things, cousin updates, and the church she attended, and an aunt in a cray who was ill, and I listened and responded and waited, because something was coming, and I had learned, in the 12 years since she had called CPS on me, to be patient with things that were coming. It arrived when the tea was ready. She said, in a tone that was warm and casual, in the practiced way of someone who had rehearsed, "I've been thinking. I'd love to spend more time with Tobias now that I'm not working as much. Maybe babysit sometimes, when you and Desmond want an evening." I set down my tea mug. I looked at her across the kitchen island that I had wanted since I was 19. I said, "Tell me more about what you're thinking." She talked for 8 minutes. I know because I clocked it in the specific way I had learned to clock things when I needed accurate records. She talked about how family was important, and how Tobias was growing up so fast, and how she had always felt a connection with him, even though they hadn't spent as much time together as she would have liked. She said she had missed things in our relationship that she wished had been different. She said she was older now and had perspective she hadn't had before. She said she hoped we could move forward. She never once said, "I was wrong to call CPS." She never once said, "I know I hurt you and I'm sorry for the specific thing I did." She moved around the actual event the way you move around furniture in the dark, touching the edges without naming it. I listened to all 8 minutes. Then I said, "I want to ask you something and I need you to answer directly." She said, "Of course." I said, "Do you know what it felt like to be 19 years old with a newborn and have a caseworker come to my door because you called?" She was quiet. I said, "Do you know what the 30 days between that visit and the follow-up felt like? Do you know how many nights I held Tobias and thought about what would happen if they decided the cold apartment was my fault and not the landlord's?" She said, "I was worried about you." I said, "You were worried about your assessment of me. There's a difference." She opened her mouth and closed it. I said, "You didn't offer to help me with the heating. You didn't offer to buy a space heater. You didn't offer to watch Tobias for a day so I could sleep. You called CPS and told them I was unfit. Those are very different forms of caring for someone." The silence that followed had a texture I had not quite anticipated. I had expected defensiveness or tears or the pivot to justification she had used on the phone 12 years ago when she said I was too emotional. What I got instead was something closer to stillness. Needs the specific quality of a person who has been accurately described and is sitting with the accuracy of the description. She said quietly, "I know I made the wrong choice." I said, "Did you? What choice did you think you were making?" She said she had thought I needed intervention. She said she had been afraid and hadn't known what to do with the fear. And the call had felt like doing something. I said, "The call felt like doing something for you. It nearly cost me everything." She looked at the countertop for a long moment. Then she said, "I know." And I heard in those 2 words something different from the explanations and justifications of 12 years ago. Not sufficient, not anywhere near sufficient, but different in a way that required me to sit with it rather than dismiss it. I asked Desmond that evening what he thought. He had been out with Tobias at a Saturday soccer game when Celestine visited and had come home after she left to find me sitting at the kitchen island with cold tea and the thoughtful quiet he had learned to read as something being processed. I told him the whole visit. He listened the whole way through. He said, "What did you want from her when she was there?" I said, "I wanted her to say it directly, not talk around it." He said, "Did she get close?" I said, "At the end." He said, "What do you want to do with that?" I said I wasn't sure. I said the part that was unresolved wasn't whether to let her back in as a person. I could handle her as a person at a distance, at family events, with the managed cordiality I developed. The unresolved part was whether to let her near Tobias. He said, "Does Tobias know what happened?" I said, "Not in detail. And he knows Celestine and I had a falling out when he was a baby and that we're not close." He said, "Does he want to be closer to her?" I thought about this. Tobias was 12 years old and had the specific self-possession of a child who had been treated as a person his entire life. He formed his own assessments, expressed them directly, and did not adopt other people's feelings as his own. He had met Celestine at family gatherings over the years and had treated her with the same polite friendliness he extended to most adults, nothing warmer. I said, "I think he's neutral." Desmond said, "Then maybe the decision is less about him and more about you." I looked at my husband across our kitchen island. He was right, as he often was, in the specific way of someone who asked the question that pointed toward what you already knew. Aunt, I called my therapist on Monday morning. Her name was Dr. Zola Mensa, a licensed clinical social worker with 18 years in practice who specialized in trauma, family systems, and the particular challenges of people who had grown up without adequate parental support. I had been seeing her for 4 years, since before the house, since before Desmond and I got serious, since a period when I had started to understand that carrying 12 years of something without processing it was not the same as being over it. Dr. Mensa had the quality of someone who held complexity without simplifying it for comfort. When I described the Saturday visit, she listened the entire way through and then said, "What was it about her almost saying it that landed differently than the explanations?" I thought about it. And I said, because the explanations were about her. The almost saying it was about me. She said, "Say more." I said, when she was explaining, she was telling me why she had done it, which put me in the position of evaluating her reasons. When she said, "I know," she was acknowledging my experience, which is what I'd been waiting for 12 years without fully knowing it. Dr. Mensa said, "What would it take for the I know to become enough?" I said, "More of it, and more specifically, and over time." She said, "That sounds like a boundary with a pathway." I said, "Is that okay?" She said, "It's the most honest version of what you actually want, which is always okay." I texted Celestine a week after her visit. I'd written 4 drafts in my phone's notes app before I sent the final version. The text said, "I've been thinking about our conversation. I'm not ready to have you babysit Tobias or have a regular role in his life right now. What I'd be willing to do is meet for coffee, just the 2 of us, and have the direct conversation that we started in my kitchen. I think that's where we'd need to begin." She responded within 20 minutes. "I understand. I'd like that." We agreed on a Saturday 2 weeks out. I told Dr. Mensa at our next session. She said, "How do you feel about it?" I said, "Like I'm doing something I have the right to do on my own terms, which is different from how most of my interactions with her have felt." She said, "That's the work." I said I knew. The coffee meeting was on a Saturday morning at a place near my hospital, a small cafe I had gone to since my residency, and which felt like mine in the way that places become yours through repeated ordinary presence. Celestine arrived on time. She looked different from the Saturday at my house, less performed, less carefully assembled. She ordered coffee, and I ordered tea, and we sat across from each other, and I said, "I need you to tell me what you did without making it about your reasons. Just the action." She looked at me for a moment, and then she said, "I called CPS on you when you were 19 and postpartum and alone, and told them I was concerned about your ability to care for a newborn. And it was wrong. Not because the apartment was warm enough or cold enough, or because you were managing fine. Because you were my family, and you were struggling, and instead of helping you, I reported you. And that was not love. It was fear wearing the costume of love, and you paid the price for my fear." I sat with that sentence for a long time, and it was the most accurate thing she had ever said to me. I said, "Thank you for saying it exactly like that." She said, "I'm sorry I took this long." I said, "I know." Which was not forgiveness exactly, but was more than I had expected to be able to offer, and felt like a place to begin building something I would control the architecture of this time. The meeting lasted 90 minutes. We talked about the 12 years in between, in a way we had not been able to before, her side of them, which I had not known, and mine, which she had only seen from a distance. She did not know about Gloria Obeng, about the documentation folder, about the nights I had put Tobias to bed and cried without a specific cause. She did not know about the drawer where I kept her Christmas cards. I told her about all of it. Not because she had earned the complete account, but because I had earned the ability to give it without it costing me something I needed. When I described the resource packet Ms. Okafor had left on my counter, Celestine looked down at her coffee. She said, "Someone who wasn't your family gave you more than I did." I said, "Yes." She said, "I'm going to have to live with that." I said, "You are, but living with it isn't the same as nothing changing." She said, "What would change look like?" I said, "Starting here and building slowly and not assuming access because we share blood." She said, "That's fair." I said, "I know it is." I drove home after and sat in the driveway for a few minutes before going inside. Tobias was in the backyard with Desmond, the two of them doing something involving a soccer ball and a timing app on Desmond's phone. And I watched them through the windshield before getting out. The house was behind them. The yard was theirs. Everything in it had been built without Celestine's help or presence, and the asking that entitled her to nothing. Not to the house, not to the yard, not to the Saturday mornings or the kitchen island, or the boy who called my husband Desi and had never gone a single day without knowing exactly how much he was wanted. She had called the government on me to report my inadequacy. What she had actually done was force me, at 19, into a process that required me to document everything and find support structures and build a case for my own fitness, which was the most thorough possible foundation for the life I built after. I did not thank her for this. That would have been too generous. And I was done being too generous with people who had not been generous with me. But I thought about it sometimes. The way the worst thing produces, in the person it's done to, an exactness and a self-knowledge that you can't acquire any other way. I knew exactly what I was made of. I had the case file to prove it. She was the one who had initiated it, and I was the one who had built on it, which was the most honest accounting of what had happened between us, and I was finally old enough to hold it without needing her to understand it too. She could have the coffee visits, she could have the occasional family events, she could have a slow and supervised path back to something that might, in years, become a relationship worth the name. What she could not have was the version of me that needed her approval. Because that version had been replaced, over 12 years of doing hard things without her, by someone who didn't need approval from anyone who hadn't earned the right to give it. I walked into my house through the front door, into the kitchen with the island and the good light, and started making dinner, and my son came in from the yard and asked what we were having. And I told him, and that was a completely ordinary Saturday evening, which is the most specific thing I can tell you about what it felt like to have finally arrived somewhere that was entirely, irrevocably mine.